Hello and welcome to Guerrilla UCD. I'm William Hudson, and for about the next 60 minutes I'll be taking you on a tour of our 16 90-minute webinars all about effective user-centered design techniques, looking at really the pith of user-centered design rather than some of the very much more elaborate user experience methods that have evolved over more recent years. The session, as I mentioned, is about 60 minutes. I'll show you how that's approximately laid out. So we're going to be looking at the introduction and boot camp in just a second. And we have the webinars split into four main chunks. So introduction and boot camp, the first chunk, that's a very small chunk. The rest of the chunks are 5 sessions each. So we have the strategy webinars, 5 of those, the tactics webinars, 5 of those, and then finally the lean and agile webinars, how to get user-centered design to fit into agile processes, and a lot of the tensions and psychological issues around that. And then when I finish the actual presentation, we'll have a bit of time for a Q&A, but you'll notice I mentioned Q&A in all these other sections too. So at the end of each section I'll stop and take any questions. And if you're watching the live webinar, then you'll find you have, courtesy of GoToWebinar, you've got a question interface. It's sort of a chat interface. So you type your question in, and then I will read the question out and answer it. If you're watching the recording, or if the questions don't occur to you until after the webinar's finished, which often happens with me when I'm watching webinars, then do please feel free to email me at william.hudson@syntam, with a silent G, syntagm.co.uk. And I'll give you that address again before we finish. It was on the title page just now. So why do this? Why are we talking about user-centered design? It's not a new process. It's been around for 20, 30 years, something like that. But of course, a really big issue for all sorts of reasons is that we're still not really very good at producing IT systems, and with a few notable exceptions like Amazon and eBay and a few others, we really aren't all that effective or efficient at producing systems which work well for users. And this is just a fairly recent example from the UK about a huge NHS project which was costing around about £13 billion. That's $15 billion approximately. And it was abandoned because it just wasn't getting anywhere. And one of the really interesting, at least interesting to me, conclusions of the UK Public Accounts Committee was that it would have been helpful if they had consulted, the health department had consulted at the start of the process with health professionals. And really this is one of the big issues, or one of the main reasons for the existence of user-centered design, is that you actually need to have some kind of understanding about users and what they actually expect and what they need out of your systems. And you can get away with small systems without doing user-centered design, and if you happen to be very talented and very much in touch with your user base, you can do it for somewhat larger systems. But if we're trying to actually produce usable systems on a regular basis, sort of on a manufacturing basis, which is the thing that we keep trying to do with software, is to treat it like a manufacturing process, then really user-centered design is an important part of that approach. The webinars themselves, as I mentioned already, there are 16 of them, and they're approximately 90 minutes long. They do vary in length, but mostly around about 90 minutes. And the focus is on cost-effective methods that are used through the whole project cycle. And that's another big issue with user-centered design, is that it's something that you set out to do from the start. It doesn't mean you can't apply user-centered design techniques later in the cycle, or even just pick it up as an approach later in the cycle. But really, for it to be most effective, it's something that we need to look at the at the outset, and we'll be talking about that on numerous occasions over the 16 webinars. The webinars themselves include the PowerPoint slides, and you'll be able to download the slides for this presentation, whether you subscribe to the rest or not. And we have a facility on the Guerrilla UCD website, which is shown, the URL is shown at the bottom of the slides, www.guerrilaucd.com. And you can spell that in a variety of different ways and still end up at the right place, I'm happy to say. But on the Guerrilla UCD website, you'll see that we have a My Webinars section, and you log in. And you'll see all the webinars that you've signed up for. And if you've only signed up for the free one, that's no problem. It'll be shown there, and you'll be able to download the slides and the recording. But also for this free overview, we will be putting links to the current slides and recording on the Guerrilla UCD page for this particular webinar. And I think you can get there by using a bit.ly address, bit.ly/GUCD, Guerrilla UCD -0. Takes you to the overview page, just a shortcut that we've created. And the way that the webinars work in terms of what you can do with them is that you're free to share them within your team. So if you want to upload the videos to a team site within your organization, that's absolutely fine. You aren't free to share them with your entire organization. Obviously, if you're a small organization, you're only about a team large, and that's not a problem. But we have supplied the webinars to large multinationals, and we use a slightly different licensing arrangement for that. So if you're interested in doing that, or if you're interested in having the webinars run at specific dates and times, as we've done for some customers, then do get in touch. It'll be the same email address as I gave you just a couple of minutes ago, william.hudson@cintam.co.uk. But we're very happy to talk to you about that as well. So this is the complete set. So getting started is the first chunk, and here we are at session 0 for the free overview. And then we move on to the Guerrilla UCD Bootcamp, then the 5 strategy webinars: visual design, navigation design, designing for search engine optimization and accessibility. Human error, messages and feedback, a very important consideration in producing good user experiences. What do you do when things go wrong? And then usability evaluation. So that's the strategy webinars. The tactics webinars, a little bit more exotic in terms of what we cover there, slightly more advanced, I suppose, is another way of looking at it. User-centered information architecture with card sorting. Dynamic web pages, how to use AJAX effectively and not just to make things more interactive for the sake of it, which is often counterproductive. Writing effective web and internet content, so that actually is for quite a broad audience in terms of content authors and so forth. Designing for advanced users, how to make more efficient user interfaces. Typically, especially when we're designing for the web, we are assuming a fairly low common denominator for business to consumer kinds of sites. And this really is the other side of the coin, looking at sites which are perhaps business to business or used very frequently by our user communities, and how do we make them more effective and efficient. And then finally, in the tactics webinars, a whole session on persuasion, trust, and seductive design, which is quite a fun session. Finally, the last chunk, as I mentioned, lean and agile, and this builds on courses that I've been teaching face-to-face for quite a few years now about how to get user-centered design and user experience design to work effectively within agile environments. And we have 5, again, webinars in this series. So making the case for UCD. Now, this is probably the only webinar out of the whole 16 that's actually specifically designed for user experience or user-centered design / usability professionals. It's all about how, if you're in that situation, if you're a UX professional and perhaps the only one in the organization or the only one per 200 or 300 engineers, which is actually quite common, how do you actually make people take you seriously? How do you get people to take an interest in what you do and to actually believe that what you do is worthwhile? So that session is all about making the case for UCD. The rest of the sessions, though, are aimed, again, at a fairly general audience. So these could be software engineers, developers, user experience people, and so forth. We've got number 13, integrating UCD and Agile, so how to basically fit the two activities together. And then looking at some more specific user-centered design tools and techniques in an Agile setting. So we have session 14, which is about user research and personas, and something called design maps, which I'm quite excited about. Session 15, talking about the differences between use cases and user stories, and also introducing my own new take on user stories, which I'm referring to as persona stories for hopefully slightly obvious reasons, but more about that when we get to it. And then finally, conceptual models and how to make good use of those, how important conceptual models are in terms of providing a coherent user experience, especially in more complicated systems. So that's the whole series. Most of the sessions, the boot camp, I should say, is half price, so that's only £22, $34, 26 euros. The rest are all priced as you see on the slide, so 52 euros or 44 pounds or $68, and you can choose which currency you get billed in when you make the online bookings. For every 5 webinars that you book, you only have to pay for 4, so you can actually get all 15 apart from the half price boot camp by paying for only 12. So that's meant to be attractive. And then finally, you can actually earn free webinars just by referring people who then go on to buy webinars. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that. It's on our special offers page. If you visit the Guerrilla UCD website, you'll see that one of the early links is special offers. And on that page, you can simply submit your email address, and it will generate a short link, which is specific to you. And if your friends or colleagues use that link and buy webinars, then for every 5 friends or colleagues that actually buy at least one webinar, you will get a free webinar. So if you're interested in seeing the Guerrilla UCD webinars but not necessarily paying for them, then this is one way of achieving that. So let's have a look at this getting started chunk. As I mentioned already, it's a fairly short chunk, so it consists of the webinar that we're currently engaged in, plus the Guerrilla UCD Bootcamp. And this will be on the 4th of April. And all of the webinars, by the way, are on Thursdays, and they're all at 4:30 London time. And aside from this one, they're all actually British summertime. So the time difference is slightly different than today's. If you're in the US today, this will be an hour. This is an hour later than all the rest, which will be an hour earlier. So in the bootcamp, we'll be looking at the benefits of usability and good user experience. We'll be talking about user-centered design in a fairly general way. Why do we have it? Why do we want it? How does it work? And we'll be talking about some of the basic psychology or psychologies around interaction, around teams, and particularly between developers and users, which is a slightly problematic area. And also looking at the psychology of some of the tools that we engage with in user-centered design, things like personas. We'll be talking about the principles of interaction, something that Don Norman refers to in his very good book, The Design of Everyday Things, called The Action Cycle. And we'll be talking about the empathy gap and empathetic design. Now, this slide is actually just to demonstrate that even large companies do weird things from a user experience perspective. This is Yahoo. It's Yahoo Groups, and it's still like this. I just checked it this afternoon. When you're on the first page of a bunch of postings in a group, then the order of the links is newest on the left and oldest on the right, and for every other page it's oldest on the left and newest on the right. And I really have no idea why they've done this. I can't believe that they've ever user tested this, but it is fantastically confusing and inconsistent. So everybody has to be on their guard. You really do have to take user experience as a kind of quality assurance. Everyone actually needs to be aware of it and thinking about it. And even the very big companies like Yahoo do make mistakes. This is a slightly smaller organization. This is the Munich Municipal Transit Organization. And I had to visit a customer in Munich last year, and I just could not, even though the site has an English version, which is what we're looking at, it was impossible for me to find the customers Autobahn, sorry, not Autobahn, Straßenbahn's stop using this map, because you had to know where you were going. There was no way of looking up a name easily and finding it on this map. The map itself was actually in very, very tiny print, and if you enlarged it, which you could do, there was either a small version or a large version. The large version was so large that you actually couldn't see more than a few hundred meters at a time. So it was just a frightening experience, and I've come across this many times when trying to use local transit websites. So for example, I had to go to San Jose in California for a conference a few years ago, and exactly the same kind of situation, that the website assumed that you knew where you were going and that you would know how things fitted together. And of course, one of the main reasons for having local transit websites is to help people who aren't local to work out how to get places, and they really just are not very good for that, unfortunately. Of course, we do spend a lot of time designing for a fictitious perfect user. This is my Ellie Kamungal bat. It appears in a few documents that I've written over the years. It's an elephant, camel, monkey, eagle bat. It's the visual acuity of an eagle, the memory of an elephant, the navigation skills of a bat, the stamina of a camel, and the dexterity of a monkey. And I was working on a team that actually was more or less designing a system that required all of this. So this was born really somewhat out of frustration that the developers really wanted to produce something fairly exciting, and I had to be the professional wet blanket, which is actually not a terribly good role to be playing from a user experience point of view, but reminding them on a regular basis that this needed to be easy to use. I've done research of my own, and I've reported it at a couple of conferences on this thing called empathy, and using a set of measures from autism research. We have an empathizing quotient and a systemizing quotient. We discover that for men in IT, the more technology-oriented they are, this is really just a measure across the bottom of what their job roles were in IT. So if you worked in IT but at the people end, so you were a user experience professional or a technical author, something along those lines, then you would answer 1 to that particular question. If you dealt with users and you dealt with technology in pretty equal measures, then you would answer 3. But if you were predominantly technology oriented, then you would have answered 5. And you can see the horrible things that the EQ line is doing across this graph, and it's taking a fair plunge. The very thin straight lines, by the way, are the averages within the normal population. And so this is actually all described in a paper that I wrote called Reduced Empathy Skills Increase the Challenges for User-Centered Design. And it can be a very serious problem depending on how much empathy there is within a design team, whether they really do understand that users are different. That's one of the biggest issues with this reduced cognitive empathy, is that people not appreciating that other people may see the problem differently and may not have the strong systemizing skills in order to actually make sense of a system that we've built for them. So the 5 strategy webinars, starting on 11th April, visual design. Obviously, most of our user interfaces these days are visual, so visual design is very important, hence it's a very early webinar in the series. We talk about visual perception, we talk about the great importance of layout and grids as a technique for ensuring good layout and consistency of layout. We talk about the appropriate use of color, which is a very big issue for legibility, especially when you start to refer to the older parts of our population. And of course, our population is actually going to be getting much older in terms of the average age over the next 30 or 40 years, very dramatically so. So being aware of the appropriate use of color is quite an important issue there. Form design we'll be looking at, and finally page design at the bottom of that. Sorry, page size is what I should have said. The fact that you can't actually be certain that people are going to be reading every single thing on your page, especially if you have been too generous in the use of vertical space. This is an example of a tool that I created, and you can still use it. It's around, called GreekThis.com, www.GreekThis.com. In fact, I produced one earlier. This is actually Amazon, and what GreekThis does is to actually try to scramble any plain text you can come across in a web page. And so you can see here that the whole left-hand navigation menu is scrambled, and various parts of the rest of the page. The things that aren't scrambled are actually graphics on the page, which you do need to be careful about. But the whole point of doing this is to actually take the information provided by the text away, so that we can ask people what they make of the content of the page. What do they think these things are, these areas of the page are? Here's an example I did just earlier with, if I can find it, here it is, the BBC website. So it looks like Welsh, but it's not. It's Greek this, and it's converted virtually all of the content on this page, which is actually a good sign, because it means the BBC have not put any content in text, which is a challenge for people relying on assistive technology. I mentioned color being an issue. One of the biggest problems we have usually within development teams is that colors are decided as a separate topic. You have a branding department often, and the brand colors may or may not be suitable for use in a digital interface. So very few of the colors we're actually looking at here are effective in terms of producing legible text, for example. So we do have to be careful, and we'll be talking about that in more detail in the visual design section. Navigation and menu design. Obviously, navigation is important in terms of getting people to the information or the features that they're looking for. So we find a lot of the time that we need to be focusing on users' goals, and that's one of the first topics we'll be talking about. We need to talk about the terminology that we use in menus and where that comes from, and we will be talking very briefly, or mentioning at least, card sorting here, but we have another more detailed session on card sorting a bit later. We'll be looking at good use of mega menus, these very large drop-down or fly-out menus that have become popular over the last couple of years. And we will be talking about accessibility, but we do again have more detailed session on accessibility a little bit later in the series. And then we'll be finishing this particular session in April on menu design for mobile devices. This is a challenging design that I have used a few times of IKEA's. It always confuses me when I arrive here. If you go to their all products section, you end up with a fairly blue collection of links, which are moderately hard to read as you get older. But aside from that, last time I was using this, I was trying to find chest of drawers to store clothes in. and I started looking at this, and I really just couldn't work out where I would find that. It turns out that this is, by default, browse by function, and what I should have been thinking about, and silly me for not actually converting my need to find a chest of drawers into the topic clothes storage, which you'll see at the bottom here, and there, lo and behold, there is chests of drawers down there. And it turns out that I would have actually done better if I'd gone to the browse by department choice, which is now not by department but by actual location, except for children's IKEA, which is a slightly different concept. So altogether, not really a great approach. I think I would have actually done better to use the A to Z being offered in the top right-hand corner there. This is a topic we'll be talking about as well. It's faceted search, and this is quite a well-known example of faceted search, which covers all the Nobel Prize winners up to 2004, and it's quite a nice demonstration of the concepts of faceted search, and we'll be talking about that in the navigation session too. Designing for search engine optimization and accessibility, so we'll be going into a lot more detail about accessibility, but we will be treating these two topics together because although they're not, they are separate topics obviously, they do have a fair bit in common because both search engine optimization and accessibility are talking about technologies that need to understand the raw HTML pages. So that's the common link between these two. So we'll be looking at the basics of search engine optimization and talking about the importance of good page structure and markup. We'll be looking also at some search engine optimization and accessibility tools and briefly introducing some of the legal requirements around accessibility and some of the other places to look for more information on accessibility. There's a lot of information out there, and we point you in the right direction. So here we have a page from Guerrilla UCD on the right-hand side and the HTML source on the left-hand side. And as I mentioned already, both web crawlers, which are used for search engines, and things like screen readers, which are used by some disabled users, need to be able to make sense of the raw HTML. What it looks like on the screen is actually totally irrelevant to these technologies. And we do have the challenge, we'll talk a bit about this as well in the AJAX session, but we have the challenge that things like Gmail, which are very, very much AJAX-based, provide some serious problems for both search engine optimization and assistive technologies. And we'll be talking about a new standard called ARIA, which is all about assistive interactions and how to address those. We will also be mentioning this rather embarrassing situation for Target, who is a chain of supermarkets in the U.S., primarily in California, I think, but they got sued for $6 million a few years back in, the suit started in 2006, and I think it was settled in 2008, and it was just their failure and complete unwillingness to do anything about it to provide an accessible website. So they ended up having to pay $6 million in compensation. So you do need to take accessibility seriously. Here in Europe, we don't really have any big profile cases like this, but this certainly is an important point to make people aware of if you're trying to persuade them of the need for at least thinking about accessibility. This happens to be an example from one of the world's largest domestic products manufacturers, and their idea that an appropriate alternative description for this image in the middle is girl riding bicycle. The link itself, if you clicked on the girl riding the bicycle, it actually took you to a page which was about the purchase or the takeover by this company of a large shampoo manufacturer. So I don't know how they thought that the user of the page was meant to get from the girl riding bicycle to this is an article about the takeover shampoo manufacturer. It's actually challenging for anyone, but if you can't see what the image is, then of course it's completely nonsensical. Session 5 is all about human error, messages, and feedback, and we talk about some of the theories behind human error, and then of course talking about preventing and planning for errors, which are two very important activities if we're going to produce successful systems and good user experiences, and how feedback and flow are important for dealing with errors, and appropriate feedback in particular. And that links in with how to attract attention sensibly, and of course error messages, and what a good error message looks like and what bad error messages look like. This is a small town near Chernobyl called Pripyat. I think it's where all of the people working at Chernobyl were housed, and it now features in half a dozen different video games, which is how I happen to know about it. But I wanted to talk about the Chernobyl accident because, in fact, it was a failure of the people operating the reactor to understand the state of the system. That wasn't particularly down to computer problems, but certainly computer problems played a big role in 3 Mile Island much earlier in Pennsylvania. This is an example, again, from Don Norman of a nuclear power control room, not Chernobyl, and I don't think it's 3 Mile Island either. I'm not sure where this actually comes from originally. The operators substituted the standard knobs with beer taps because they were having a hard time telling one tap from the other, or one knob from the other, I should say. And in fact, this was meant to control the control rods, and raising the control rods increased the activity in the reactor, and lowering them decreased it. And one of these levers was for up, and the other one was for down. So it was important that you got it right, but it obviously wasn't very clear which was which. So you'd think they'd get that right in a nuclear control room, but never mind. We'll talk about that kind of thing. This is an error message from about 10 years ago, but I just love it so much because it's just so typical of I've got to produce an error message, but I'm not really sure what it should say. And you still see messages like this. I still see probably about one a week of this kind of message. There's an error, but I'm not going to tell you what it is. So given all the things I've had to type in here, it's just telling me that I've not done it right, and it won't give me even a clue about what the problem actually is. And needless to say, this is not terribly good from a user experience perspective. Microsoft has a nice page about error messages, and these are extracted from that, and you can follow this bit.ly link at the bottom here to get to the original. But what's, I think, entertaining about these messages is that they're really not sensible error messages at all. They're talking about things that in the bottom right-hand corner, for example, you can't delete the file because it's already being deleted, so why complain? The bottom left-hand corner, it makes it sound like the user has just done something extremely inappropriate, and that all hell is going to break loose so they don't do something about it, and so on. And we'll be talking a lot around this kind of issue in the error messages section. The final chunk of the final session in this chunk is 16th of May, and it's about usability evaluation. And we'll be looking at a whole range of different methods. User testing is really the gold standard when it comes to usability evaluation, but there are others, and some of them are more appropriate given where you are and how much budget you've got and what you actually want to achieve. So we'll be talking about 8 or 10 different kinds of approaches, including things like benchmarking. I've done a lot of benchmarking over the years, primarily of intranets, but also of e-commerce sites. So this is a benchmark of mine on on e-commerce site, and what the figures are actually showing you is how this particular site is doing relative to a couple of dozen similar sites. So we can see just by looking at this radar chart that they're doing extremely well on accessibility, but actually anything in the white circle, which runs from about 70 to 90 in these standardized scores, is bad news. That's the bottom quartile. So this particular site is not doing terribly well on engagement, on trust, or on the actual checkout process. So this is something that benchmarking can give you that other approaches cannot, and we'll be talking about a number of other alternatives to benchmarking and usability testing in general. This is A/B testing, and of course it's a very attractive procedure since it doesn't involve having to physically drag people into a laboratory or pay them any kind of compensation. But of course it doesn't tell you why one design is doing better than another, so we have to bear that in mind when we're trying to choose an appropriate technique. And along those lines, we also sometimes have to try to present our often qualitative usability evaluation results based on a small number of samples. We have to work out how to present those in ways which are more acceptable to perhaps our quantitatively oriented technical colleagues. So this is something called a fishbone or an Ishikawa diagram, and it's used in something called root cause analysis. But it's a very well accepted and very well understood means of demonstrating particular collection of problems. And so I've taken this particular problem, which is poor conversion rate, and identified four main issues for this site: navigation, legibility, trust, and page layout. And then the smaller items feeding into the main fishbones, as it were, are the individual contributions from these different factors. So broken links feed into the trust issue, images not loading feed into the trust issue, no company info on the site feeds into the trust issue, and so on. So I'll stop and just see if we have any questions at this point. So again, if you are watching the live webinar, you have a question interface and you're welcome to use it. If not, I will press on, and again, as I mentioned, you can email me with questions. Or there's also Twitter at Guerrilla UCD if you'd like to follow up anything here. Webinar number 7 is user-centered information architecture with card sorting. You can use card sorting for a variety of different things. You can actually use it for screen or form design, but mostly we use it for menu and navigation design. And we'll be talking about the basics of card sorting, and we'll be looking at open versus closed sorting, face-to-face versus virtual on-screen sorting, talking about what constitutes good terminology. And we'll also be going into some of the background, how to avoid pitfalls of navigation, and how to make sense of the results. So looking at cluster analysis and some of the basic ideas behind the results that we get from the typical card sorting exercise. Here is an example of our own card sorting tools called CAPS, for computer-aided paper sorting, and we have our own software for processing and analyzing these barcoded cards. It also works for a couple of the most popular online sites as well. Optimal Sort and Web Sort will both output data in SynCaps format. SynCaps is the name of our cluster analysis and card sorting analysis software package for Windows. Here's an online card sort from WebSort, and as I mentioned, the other one is, WebSort on the left, I should say. So this is WebSort on the left, and it's Optimal Sort, now called Optimal Workshop, on the right-hand side. They're both fairly similar, but they do have some important differences. just to be aware of. But typically when I'm trying to do something, I'll go and have a look at both and just make sure that I can do everything I want with the current set of features. And the pricing also tends to be slightly different between the two. This is an output, this is a chart from SynCaps, and those two online sorting packages have also now adopted a fairly similar approach to presenting this information. I think one of them's even pinched the blue color. But this is showing us all the possible pairings of cards. The darker the blue outline, the more frequently users sorted the cards together. And in this particular case, the black centers indicate that this is how it was done on the original intranet. And so we can see travel expenses in this example. Users actually, or the participants in the card sort, put travel expenses down with the other expenses, and that's where it was in the intranet as well. But in fact, there was quite a lot of overlap with travel too. So, sorry, that's in fact the right answer is that it actually was in travel in the current intranet, and that users put it in with expenses. So it's a way of comparing your existing information architecture with what users are actually expecting. Session number 8 is on dynamic web pages, and we look at some of the psychology of dynamic displays. There's some really interesting perceptual issues, for example, something called change blindness and inattention blindness. And we do introduce the basic principles of AJAX, how AJAX works, how AJAX is different to earlier approaches, static web pages, for example. We'll be looking at AJAX guidelines, and we'll be talking about how AJAX impacts search engines and accessibility. And we'll be looking at a very simple worked example, something that you could actually knock up yourself if you wish to in JavaScript, and get it to work in real time. This is a comparison of AJAX versus a static web page. So here we are, the standard page request without scripting. Eventually returns a whole page, but in AJAX we have a script running in the background which actually sends a request away. The request comes back, hopefully, and triggers an event handler. Now, we have some interesting problems around that, and one is how long is that going to take, and also what is the event handler meant to do if it's never called. So if the server in question never responds, what do we do then? In the traditional view of things, the browser would just report an error to the user, but in the AJAX scenario, the one that we're looking at here, that's now your problem, the developers or interaction designers' problem. So what are you going to do about it? So that's some of the issue that we need to address. Session number 9, writing effective web and intranet content. We need to talk about content from a user's perspective. What do users want from your content? What are they expecting to find? What are they here to do or to investigate? We're going to talk about the inverted pyramid approach, which is a common approach to in journalism for writing easily accessible text. Visual structure of information. We'll be looking at the two topics of readability and legibility. They are different. Sometimes the words get used interchangeably. And we will be talking about readability metrics, not highly thought of in some circles, and certainly there are good reasons for that. But they do give us a way of actually being able to say that this page is acceptable or this page is not acceptable, without having to get into a personal fight with a content author over it. So it does have some advantages, and we do look at a study that I did of readability of intranets in large organizations with multinational audiences. And this is a wonderful quote that I picked up some years ago now from a HR site at a large multinational company. After nearly 10 years of group businesses and functions developing locally specific organizational models, the opportunity has been taken by the group unification and the appointment of a single chief executive to simplify the organization by giving clear accountability to business and functional leaders and eliminating duplication. That is one sentence. It's got a couple of commas, but that actually gets a readability score of 0, which is actually very bad. It makes no sense, regrettably. It's really gobbledygook, and in fact HR sites are very good at that. So if you're looking for some good examples of how not to write readable content, then you can often find it, I'm sorry to say, at an HR site near you. This is the study I did, or a very quick summary of it, looking at readability of pages intended for general audiences within large organizations. And what I discovered was that smaller companies who actually had a commitment to using plain English did noticeably better than those who did not, but particularly multinationals. And so higher readability scores are better. The recommended range for adult readership is somewhere between 60 and 70. We hardly ever see that in an intranet, but it is possible to find that on the web, and I'll give you some examples of that in the session. Session number 10, designing for advanced users, and here's where we need to actually step back and have a look at ease of learning, which is what we're primarily interested with when we're dealing with the general public, versus efficiency of use, which is the flip side of the coin. So we're now talking about situations where perhaps we need to make this quicker, more direct, because people are going to be interacting with it for hours every day. We look at something which has been around for several decades now called the keystroke level model, but it actually happens to be a very good way of predicting how efficient an interface is going to be. We'll be talking about Fitt's law. Paul Fitts did some studies back in the 1950s about movement time, and it actually impacts the design of web pages and screens in general. And we'll talk about why that is and what to do about it. And we'll also be looking at the art of efficient shortcuts and addressing something that I refer to as micro usability, which is all about making things usable at a very, or efficient, I should say, at quite a low level of detail. This is a screenshot of a package called COG tool. It's a research tool. It has got practical application as well from Carnegie Mellon, and it will actually predict for you the efficiency of a user interface. You have to describe the interface to the tool, but it will then give you figures like we can see here. These are command line versus graphical interface comparisons for the same functions. So if you are interested in doing this in a big way, then COG tool might well be worth having a look at. But we can just talk about, or we do just talk about, the principles of the keystroke level model in the session. This is a little tool that I was playing with for a while. It's just a mouse odometer. You install it, and it keeps track of where you move the mouse on the screen and how far the mouse has been. I think I had this only installed for a couple of hours when I took this particular screenshot, and it already traveled 51 meters with my mouse. So you can use this kind of approach for measuring the overall efficiency or effectiveness of a user interface. So it's interesting from that perspective. Session number 11, persuasion, trust, and seduction, and we look at the psychology of persuasion. There's now been a lot of work in this particular area, and similarly, trust, why people trust or fail to trust websites in particular. We'll be looking at comparative web credibility. So how do you decide whether one site is more credible than another. And this was actually one of the main foundations of some of the work done in persuasive technology research. And we'll be looking also at user goals and emotional journeys. And finally finishing on seductive design and something called the halo effect. This was a study that I did for a particular customer, looking at their current site for a particular series of operations relative to a mock-up. And we were measuring users' emotional journeys. We're asking them how they felt now that they've visited each page in the sequence, positive at the top, negative at the bottom, and we started them off at a fairly neutral situation. So that's one of the things that we can do to try to work out whether we're on the right lines in terms of addressing people's actual needs. I'll stop again, as I promised, just to see or take any questions. And as there are none, I will carry on into the last chunk of 5 webinars, the Lean and Agile webinars. Now we've built in a break this year over the summer, so we're running the first 11 Guerrilla UCD webinars from April through June. We're doing none in July and August. And of course, it really doesn't matter exactly when you've got your holidays or vacations planned and so forth, because you will always be able to download the recordings afterwards and the slides and so forth. But we aren't running any webinars live in July and August this year, so we pick up again in September. So session number 12 is this one that I mentioned, which is aiming to make the case for user-centered design and agile. And really, this is probably the only webinar in the whole series which is focused primarily on user experience professionals. And it's talking about, or we talk about understanding your audience and the fact that they may not actually value qualitative research, because that's a natural tendency of people who are more technology focused. So we actually do need to look at metrics and making the most of metrics, and how do we leverage metrics to make the case for user experience design and user-centered design, and generally building a persuasive case for doing UCD and making sure that people understand your contribution to the process. UCD and Agile has to be done differently. This particular slide is contrasting the kind of approach that we used in the 1990s, the OO approach at the top, with an Agile approach at the bottom. And it highlights the fact that OO was very much a problem-oriented, the waterfall style, but OO in general itself was also problem-oriented. We spent a lot of time building models, trying to understand the problem a bit better, and then finally getting on to programming and functional testing is perhaps only the last 20 or 30% of the overall effort. Contrast that with Agile, where user stories are done relatively quickly up front, and then we move very much into implementation and testing phase, which is the bulk of the effort in the project, and then functional testing after that. And the challenge that we have, of course, is how to fit all these traditionally upfront activities in user-centered design into the whole scheme of things, and that's what we'll be talking about in many different places in these 5 Lean and Agile UCD webinars. So that's the issue, that the user-centered design stuff we used to do up front that really isn't so appropriate if you're trying to build on an iterative approach like Agile. Session 13 is about integrating these approaches, and we look at some of the background of the philosophy of Agile, the Agile Manifesto, and some of the inherent tensions that the manifesto and our traditional approach to UCD and user experience design actually creates. So some of the friction points and what we need to do about those. We'll be looking again at this issue that I mentioned of empathetic design and how we can actually make our development teams more aware of the limitations and needs of users. We'll be looking at the parallel streams approach, which is now quite common in organizations who are doing user experience design within Agile, and addressing some of the changes that we need to make in order to have users as the focus of development. And as I mentioned at the outset, this approach called design maps from Tamara Adlin, I like very much as a collaboration tool for communicating user requirements to the development team on a per cycle basis, and that's one of the things we'll be talking about in session 13. We'll also be talking about chickens versus pigs and how skunks feature in Agile. So these are all very much Agile animals, and we'll be saying why. I'll leave you to ponder. You may be familiar with chickens and pigs in an Agile setting, and perhaps the skunk is new to you, but I'm not going to spoil the fun here. We look at the parallel streams approach, as I mentioned, and this is one part of that, trying to actually, on the user experience stream, cope with what's coming as well as with what's already been done. Session 14, Agile User Experience, looking at user research, personas, and design maps. So we spend a little bit more time going into some of the detail here, and particularly talking about these tools called personas and persona stories, and something called a persona weighted feature matrix, which we'll go into more detail about. And the fact that we are wired, our brains are wired to be empathetic about individuals, not large groups of people. So this guy would be the focus of our attention in a persona approach to users, rather than talking about this vast collection of potential users. This is an illustration of a design map, courtesy of Tamara Adlin, and we'll be talking about these and how they can, I feel, be used very effectively in collaborating between the UX and development streams of our Agile approach. Just going to talk about the last couple of sessions now and then take any final questions. Session number 15, looking at use cases versus user stories, and also now persona stories, which is something that I'm currently working on, as well as scenarios and how these all fit together, what the differences are, how to, for example, use use cases as an alternative. They did drive software development throughout the 1990s, use cases, and they can still be applied very effectively. And then finally, how sketches, storyboarding, and wireframes fit into the whole scheme of things. This is a use case diagram. They're still very useful even if you're not dealing with use cases. They actually can be used for user stories too if you wish. And then finally, session number 16, looking at conceptual models. And this is actually built on an approach from the usability group at IBM, which I think was first produced in the late 1990s. Dave Roberts and his colleagues wrote a book about something called OVID, Objects, Views, and Interaction Designs. And this particular session is really building on that original work. So those are the 16 webinars. Here's a little example of some conceptual models. These are just slightly fancy entity relationship diagrams. This is looking at the difference between what are referred to in UML as domain models. So this is a domain model of a lift or an elevator versus the user model. And you'll notice if I just flick backwards and forwards, there's actually a substantial difference. Users don't need to know about 2/3 of the components in this domain model, but they do need to be aware of things like the call button and the floor indicator and so forth, which is the user's conceptual model. So it's an important distinction. And here, just by way of comparison, is the user's conceptual model of the Amazon website. So we'll take any final questions. Again, if you are watching the recording or the questions only occur to you later on, then do feel free to email me, and I'm hoping that my email address is going to be on the very next slide. Yes, there it is at the bottom. But you'll find information, much more information, and also further reading, books and articles and so forth on the Guerrilla UCD website. You can visit the special office page if you're interested in taking up the referrals approach to getting free webinars. And once you have got a My Webinars account, then you can look at all of your slides and recordings and so forth by logging into that. I'll hang on for just a minute to see if there are any last-minute questions. And if not, I will thank you very much for listening and hope to have you on one of the future sessions. Thanks very much. Bye.